We start off with pistols, as I feel they are the simplest weapon and explain the more complex elements we'll come across later for each game. The first weapon then is the 1911 for Battlefield 4. Technical info is as follows: 5,511 vertices, 11,507 edges, and 6,274 triangles. That is with it being unmerged. When they are merged, which is the process of merging by distance, which gets rid of duplicate vertices. You go down to 3,355 vertices, 9,622 edges, and 6,274 triangles. The triangles stay the same because you're mostly messing around with the edges and vertices. The reason for this is because the models that are from the exporters are reconstructions. They're not the exact models, as I've stated in the disclaimer. Thus, I saw it fit to include the unmerged and merged numbers so we could get a more closer idea of what the actual number would be for the actual model. The gun is in a broken up state when it gets imported in Blender, so I had to create 5 vertex groups to reconstruct the gun. Those would be the magazine, the barrel, the slide, the trigger, and the hammer. All of these are parts that move in the game in some kind of way, so they have to be animated, thus they're exploded because of how Frosty handles the weapon skeleton. Thus you get 2 objects and then 2 materials. The shader setup is relatively simple for Battlefield 4, and this is going to be the shader setup all the weapons use for this comparison. You start with a diffuse layer, which is the color basically of the model. Then you have the specular texture, which does something called channel packing, which is where you use multiple color channels of a texture to put multiple textures in one, essentially. This means that for one texture, you have the channel red, which is smoothness, channel green, which is metallic, and then you have channel blue, which is your ambient occlusion. Then, of course, you have a normal map, which is just used to give detail and give definition to a model, so it doesn't have to model everything on the model itself, so it can be lower polygon count because it's for a game and not for anything else. And then there's this other texture, the weapon normal, which is this texture that I'm assuming most Battlefield 4 guns have, which is meant to give dents and scratches in the actual normal instead of them being painted on. I'm assuming they do this so they can control it for everything. They don't have to put it on every texture. It's effectively a decal map. That's how they use it. The weapon info is pretty simple. I'm using IMFDB for these, so I'm not a gun person. I don't own guns IRL. I just like them in video games, right? They say it's a Vickers tactical custom variant of the 1911, which cross-referencing it says that it appeared in Medal of Honor Warfighter before Battlefield 4. Then it found its way in BF4, and then it was even in Hardline, apparently. In Warfighter, it had its logos stamped on the gun, the actual Vickers company logos on it. They're still there. We'll get to that when we get to the texture part, but that's what the weapon is. So the first detail we have is the shared bullet material under the name of bullet grenade. The way Battlefield 4 handles a lot of the bullets is they have a shared decal sheet for the texture, which uses the exact same shader structure as the weapon. It's one texture for every kind of bullet. It also is called grenade, so I'm assuming it's used for stuff like the M320 grenade and or the MGLs or whatever. So that's how that one works. It's pretty common practice. It has an interesting thing on the gun texture, says 8 bullets. Other texture details include a Vickers logo, which is still on the grip. You still see it there on the diffuse layer. It's scrubbed off in the normal map, but it's still there on the diffuse. Same with the slide. It has a V tactical on it in the middle, which you can pretty easily assume is referencing Vickers tactical. Near the relief cuts for the trigger, you have parts that are more shiny, showing that it's being brushed on people's hands, applying usage. This is how Battlefield 4 usually tackles wear on the weapons. There is wear on these models. It's not that they're fully clean, but the way BF4 tackles it is completely different to 6, which we'll get to when we get to the BF6 1911. There are markings which are accurate to the real 1911, though Wilson is not stamped, kind of like the Vickers logo on the grip. I'm assuming again they just don't have the rights, or they don't want to necessarily allude to what this is exactly. It's a very specific attempt there to remove the Wilson logo from the stamping, but it's still there on the diffuse. And there's a Wilson on the iron side, funnily enough. The safety and the slide are a very weird reddish color. I don't know if this is intentional or unintentional. It seems deliberate. So it's definitely not a mistake, but it gives some color pop that otherwise would only be there for the grip. Moving on to Battlefield 6's M45A1, we start to see a lot more geometry being present. And unmerged, we have 11,731 vertices, 23,318 edges, and 12,038 triangles. When you do merge them, the verts go down by an immense amount, down to 5,819, 16,896 edges, and the triangles stay the same. We have 6 vertex groups this time around, 6 meshes, which in this case again is the imported files that I have to put in Blender in order to reconstruct the gun. Due to Battlefield 6 having attachments, obviously the guns are not going to be a set in stone single mesh. There's going to be different, for example, the magazine. Of course, there's magazine options, so you're going to have separate magazine mesh. This rounds up to 8 objects that have 3 materials. Battlefield 6's shader setup is a lot simpler on the face of it. This time you don't have to work with 3 textures. You have 2, technically 3, but we'll get to it. So you have a color smoothness map is channel pack. The RGB is the same, but it puts the smoothness in the alpha channel, which means that it has to feed off the alpha channel for the smoothness. And then you have an NMT map, which is a normal metallic map, which also includes AO in it, which is the blue channel. It's pretty much that. There's this WO texture, which is used for wear when they use camo. This one is finicky. I tried to see if it could work. It works, but you have to have the right camo, and there is some shader magic you gotta do to get it right. But it exists as a texture. Every piece has it. The weapon info is as follows. It's an M45A1 from Colt CQBP, which is an upgrade to the previous M45s the Marines used. Conceptually, it's not that different from BF4s, but we'll get to that in the comparison. The details are you have a massive D23 armory marking with a blue marker on the slide on the back, which the color it has permutates around the gun, around the trigger relief guards and the beaver tail. There's random markers there. I don't know the importance of the markers that are not the D23. I don't know if it's intentional, meant to look like a mistake, or it's supposed to be something else, because I understand what the D23 is. I just don't know what the markers are on the back. Of course, big M45A1 text on the slide. There's a QR code in front of the trigger guard, and they name drop Cold Hartford on the side of the gun, much like BF4s. There's a thread protector for this gun, because again of the attachments, the thread protector is a separate model, much like any muzzle attachment that you could give it. The slide serrations are modeled in this time. They're not just on the normal map. That's because the slide is a separate mesh. It's not part of the base gun. There is this weird shape on the grip, which is accurate to the real gun. When I mean shape, I mean the way the material for the grip is made. The cutout near the mag release for it makes it look like there's some sort of UV flaw, but it's pretty accurate to the real thing. Though most real guns I've seen in references for this video, for M45, is they don't usually have a two-tone camouflage, or a two-tone paint rather. They usually have one tan that permeates throughout the gun, but this two-tone that it has, where the magwell and the lower part are this darker shade where the slide is a bit lighter, does give it more visual interest, so I understand why it was done. But that is something to keep in mind. Name thing. There is on the other part of the slide the government model text, which makes sense. Comparing these two guns is relatively easy because they start to show a lot of the differences between the games in terms of how they handle model and textures. You start to see the overarching differences and everything else in between. Obviously, we see that Battlefield 4 is a lot more simple in the model side. We do also notice how the textures from Frosty for BF4 are the actual high res, as high as they go textures. The exports from the BF6 stuff, the mega library, are not as accurate. BF6's guns, much like 2042's, have a lot of texture artifacting, even in game. It was really bad in 2042. They managed to fix it with 6, although it's noticeable enough if you look really hard on some of the guns. This does affect, obviously, the way it looks. Artifacting, it's usually artifacting because the image is compressed due to file sizes and optimization and all that, which is why the textures when they're zoomed in don't look that good. But it's also because the mega library doesn't have the full 4K or the high res textures. These are the standard ones, which is why they look like this. I wish I had access to the 4K textures because they'd look better for renders, but nevertheless, these are the only textures I have for the guns. But from far away, BF6's guns look okay in Blender, and I think that's by design. Most of the time, you're going to be looking at a gun from a certain distance. Nevertheless, that's the texture stuff. As for the guns, you notice how their textures are constructed with what they show, what they look like. BF4's textures are usually very sleek. There is a wear. It's not like the BF4 textures for the BF4 1911 aren't weathered in some kind of way. But the way BF4 does weathering is a lot less overt, and it's mostly surface variation where that catches the light. You don't see direct edge wear most of the time, which is interesting to see. Of course, edge wear isn't always very common unless the gun is very beat up, so it makes sense. Whereas Battlefield 6's guns are a lot more beat up, a lot more weathered, very much trying to tell a story with the texture, that the gun is used a lot. Again, BF4 does this as well, but it's a lot more subdued. Not sure which approach is necessarily better, but that's how each game does it. Of course, we see the massive increase in objects here because BF6 has the attachment system and all that. Overall, looks wise, I prefer the BF4 one. Not saying I hate the BF6 one. I've always been a sucker for more cleaner 1911s, and the M45 here is supposed to invoke this grungy, weathered, beat up feeling with the textures in the visuals of a 1911. I much prefer the sleeker, cleaner BF4 one. It's probably something to do with me really liking the silver brawlers from Hitman, but that's how I see this comparison. The gun sounds and how they operate in game. The BF4 shooting sounds a lot like a drum snare, which is pretty common for most BF4 pistols. They sound exactly like this or in some kind of way like this. Whereas BF6's shooting sounds a lot like somebody hitting on a hard wood. I really don't like both of the sounds. They don't really do anything for me, both of the games. I guess BF6's sounds a bit more bassy, but that's because I have war tapes on it, and so I don't know if that's by design for the audio of the gun or just the mixing doing it. BF4's reload is pretty lazy, all things considered. It's really not that interesting, and it's reused animations for both empty and tactical. Although I'm not the biggest fan of BF6's reload either, I'm gonna be honest. BF6's reload is, again, it does the thing where you retain the mag for a tactical reload, which, I don't know. It's the motions it takes, they're not badly made. It's just they don't really do anything for me, so pretty mediocre. If I had to choose one on looks alone, I'd choose the BF4 one.